Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have recovered after our very intensive program of discussion yesterday afternoon and our dinner. As I was saying, every time there is a fight between Swiss punctuality and Indian punctuality, Switzerland is on the losing side. But we will have time, and as always, it will mean that our lunch will be later than scheduled. We are starting the day with this notion which preoccupies many of you of volatility. And some people are saying that volatility has become a built-in factor of the global economy. Some people will perceive the present volatility as higher than what they have seen in the past. And it is true that there are some factors feeding volatility today. For instance, still the uncertainty about the pace and extent of the tapering in the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing policy. Volatility because we have seen currencies in some emerging market countries being under attack. Volatility because there are some uncertainties about how China will navigate the shift that it needs to do and that it is trying to do from one new growth model to another growth model. Volatility because of geopolitical factor. Some people are saying that the Ukraine situation might have some significant impact, whether direct or indirect. Some people, observers, analysts are dismissing that as completely irrelevant to what we see in the economic domain. So this is why we felt it would be important to start our discussion today, trying to get a sense on whether we are in a kind of structural volatility mode, whether it is a kind of increase that, and the parenthesis, if you want, might be closed in the coming period. What are the factors, and how do we deal with that? How do we manage that? How do we integrate that in our corporate and national economic strategies? So let me introduce very briefly, because you have their bios in the speaker's booklet, and let me tell you why we have selected this very strong group of speakers to discuss this topic with us today. First of all, to my immediate right is Jonathan Spector. He is the chief executive of a conference board in the United States. And I don't think I need to tell you what the conference board is. It is a very large business organization. So through their research, through the feedback from their members, the activities of their members, they are really on the pulse of the US business community. And of course, this US business community is very present in China, in India, in emerging market countries. And of course, we know the impact of the way the economy is going in the US will have on the rest of the global economy. Then, next to Jonathan, we have Aharon Fogel, who is the chairman of the IDB Development Corporation in Israel. Jonathan Fogel is one of the most eminent personality in the Israeli business financial community. As you know, it is a very vivid, very dynamic community. And IDB in Israel is, I would say, maybe the number one financial institution in terms of investment, very respected. So your views will be very interesting for us in terms of how you look at volatility and the impact it has. Then we have N.K. Singh. Mr. N.K. Singh, I think for any Indian in the room, doesn't need any introduction. He's a very prominent figure. He's a member of parliament, and he has been advising the Prime Minister on economic issues. He's very involved. He's a very respected, eminent economist, but he knows not only, of course, the in and outs of Indian economy, but of course he has a very global perspective about what is happening. And then last but not least, we have Robert Shapiro, who has been Undersecretary in the US administration, and he's now the Chief Executive Officer of Sonecon in the US. Sonecon is a firm advising companies on investment, on economic strategies. Mr. Shapiro, from his background and from his present activities, has this kind of global picture about where the economy is going, where are the risks, and where are, of course, the opportunities. So let me turn to you, Jonathan. And I think from the feedback from your members, from the perception that you get when discussing with your member, from the result of the research you do, I think it will be important, first of all, to understand whether this perception of increased volatilities is something that exists really, or it is just a kind of perception which is not based on facts, on realities. And I think it will be important to see and to understand how this impact on economic decisions, on the way at the moment US companies and the US business community, whether dealing in the US or in countries like China or India, a huge percentage of your members have activities in these two countries. How does it impact on what they do there? Please.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's a little bit of, I guess there's no clear-cut black and white answer to your question about whether the sense of volatility is increasing, if it's factual or if it's perception, and whether executives are taking it as a crisis or just as a normal issue. I think there's evidence sort of on both sides. I will say that some of the research that I'm going to talk about, we do have members actually, although we are US-centric from our 100-year history. The survey research that we've done is global, and we have members around the world. So I think it's important, and there are actually differences, and I'll highlight those. I think there are 4 or 5 reasons why volatility is on the agenda this morning. The first is that we're just coming out of a huge economic cycle. Economic cycles are really the definition of volatility, and so it's very natural, I think, for us to view it that way. There has been a macro shift in the economic structure of the world over the last decade, a more pronounced shift than there has been, and more pronounced, we think, than there will be over the next decade. 10 years ago, what we call today developing economies represented 40% of global GDP. This year is the tipping point where developing economies, this is adjusted for purchasing power parity, but it's the best measure of the relative sizes of the output. This is the first year where developing economies will be half or very slightly more than half of the global economy. So there's been a very significant shift. 40 to 50% over a decade is a very big shift. There have been regional shifts that have been and are taking place. In China, first, China is much bigger as a part of the global economy, but market reforms, by definition, create volatility, right? I mean, we just saw, a couple of weeks ago, as the yuan is released to fluctuate in a wider band, and it did. And by definition, that's sort of more volatile. In the US, I think there are 2 fundamental changes, one of which we've already started to see, the other we're going to see. And Ronnie Chan mentioned this yesterday, energy. The energy environment in the US has changed very significantly over the past 3 years. I think over the next few years, we're going to see the impact of IT and particularly big data. And so those 2 changes, I think, are going to fuel a significant expansion in the US. And I think another factor is that the economy continues to globalize. I think maybe all of us thought 10 years ago that the economy was fully global, but it's becoming more and more global, in fact, every year. Just the events of the past few weeks, we were talking to one of our big members, Boeing, and Boeing obviously do great technological things, and they're making their planes out of titanium. And where do you think they get, much of their titanium from? Well, it's from Russia, and so, they're very focused on that issue. And then, of course, there's the greater velocity of information that moves around the world quickly. So I think those are all reasons why volatility is high, or perceived to be high, both. We've just done to your point about perception, and I'll finish with this. We've just done a survey of 1,000 CEOs around the world, and we asked them to say what keeps them awake at night. And one of the issues we asked them is basically volatility. We call it political and economic risk. 2 years ago, that ranked number 3 on the list of challenges. And we had never seen it. We've been doing this survey for 12 or 13 years. We had never seen it in the top 5. Last year, it fell to number 5. This year, it fell to number 6. In India, by the way, it's number 3 this year. So I think there are regional differences, but in general, I would say that CEOs are not so much lying awake at night worried about the volatility. I think they've adapted to it for the most part. We do see them improving their planning processes in response to the volatility. And I think that's a different mindset than 3, 4, 5 years ago, when I think it was more of a crisis, perhaps, in people's minds.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me turn to Ron Shapiro. As I mentioned, you have been serving in public office. You have been advising president in their campaigns on economic issues. You advise companies today and you advise government entities. What are today, when you look at the global picture, the risk factors which, as I mentioned in my introduction, are seen or are real in terms of feeding this notion of volatility? I think Jonathan mentioned a very interesting example that in a way, a company like Boeing, you might think that they have nothing to do with the Ukraine crisis, and all of a sudden you have this titanium element which comes into the picture. So how do you look at the sources of risk, or the real risk? And let me just add one point to make it more complex. What do you think about people talking about the risk of China having its lemon moment, as people say today, and to what extent does it impact on this notion of risk and volatility?
Yes.
Jonathan.
Thank you. First, let me say what a pleasure it is to be here. And I'm delighted to have been asked to serve on this panel with my distinguished fellow panelists. As an economist, we look at long time periods, and frankly, we are in an extended period of global financial instability that we have not seen since the 19th century. We have seen a succession of financial meltdowns. It began in the mid-'80s in Latin America. It spread to Mexico. By the mid-'80s, it was in Spain, Sweden, and Japan in the early '90s. It was in East Asia in the later '90s. It then spread to the United States and then to the European Union. This tells us that there are elements in the globalization of capital which we do not understand, but which are causing very large distortions that go across borders. The fact that we don't understand it means that it's probably not over. And the natural question, and economists like myself and others and economic policymakers have been very concerned about China as the next stage of this moving financial crisis. Certainly the domestic constituents of a crisis are there. The banking system is, by Western standards, insolvent. That is the major state banks. This has been, in effect, a matter of policy for some time. These banks have been designed largely to channel personal savings into state-owned enterprises to maintain employment. as China winds down the state-owned enterprises and shifts more to a market-based model for employment. This has involved in a very extended period of low interest rates and an artificially low value to the currency, and the distortions in that have built up. If China were integrated in the global financial system, I think we would have seen a financial crisis in China. It's not. China has insulated itself at significant cost to China, while China tries to build domestic financial institutions to take the place of the state-run financial system. But you know, the distortions which can create a financial crisis in a nation which is integrated in the global capital markets, those distortions don't go away. And what we are seeing instead is a significant slowdown in growth in China. I would expect, you know, economists are not supposed to, everyone expects us to forecast. We never want to forecast, except that that's all anyone is interested in hearing from us. We're much better at understanding things that have already occurred than those which haven't. But if we look at the structural factors driving the development of the Chinese economy today, one would expect a extended period of growth slower than China has seen for decades. A period of growth in the range of 4%, for example. The social and political implications of that are unknown. They have been a matter of great concern to the Chinese leadership for a long time, which is one of the reasons why we have had such an extended period of artificially stimulated growth domestically.
But in a way, just to follow up on one point, you might say at the same time that a slowdown in China, if it is the result of a policy which is really aiming at shifting to another model of growth, might be a factor for reducing instability. Because in a way, you might get into a more predictable trajectory.
Well, one can say, the U.S. crisis, in effect, eliminated some of the sources of instability in our economy. We paid much, much too high a price. We could have eliminated those sources without a financial collapse if we had had sounder policy and a different culture, frankly, in our financial system. One can say the same thing about China. Yes, a period of slow growth, of extended slow growth, assuming that the political and social response can be well managed, may indeed precipitate a shift to a more balanced model for China, which is less dependent on investment, more dependent on consumption, but it might not. Those are choices which policymakers make, particularly in China. It will require enormous discipline, frankly, to make those choices in China, because the internal incentives would lead to a return to many of those incentives to the current model.
Thank you. Let me turn now to you, Mr. Singh. As I mentioned, nobody needs an introduction more than you, because everybody knows the role you play and you have played on the Indian economic and political scene. At the moment, talking about volatility, in a way, you get the feeling that in India, this perception of outside volatility and domestic volatility because of a political context, we will have elections in the next 6 weeks or so, in a way is making people, business leaders, corporations, sitting on their hand trying to see what will come and how things will or might stabilize before making some important strategic decisions. How do you assess, from your perspective, this volatility, whether we are looking at the external global economy or whether you are looking at an important economy like India's economy?
Well, I think that one straight away something, Claude, I agree with you that increased global interdependence has certainly accentuated the implications of volatility. As long as India was a comparatively closed economy, what happened in the rest of the world was not affecting our banking and financial system. And I think that we took some pride in the fact that we had escaped many other financial crises earlier. And even in the last financial crisis, we took pride in the fact that if we had been far more leveraged with the global economy as some of the other countries, the consequences and the spillover effect of volatility would have been much sharper. Having said that, the fact remains that since trade is a percentage of GDP, to take just one index of globalization, which till, let us say, till about 1991, trade as an index of GDP was no more than 14%, is today
our motivation, interests, we read the rules of the game and react accordingly. So the rules of the game are very important, how to get to the target. Target may be an interim target to reduce volatility, for example. So, for example, for me, the former Soviet Union was the ultimate example for market economy. Everyone used the United States to be so. Why I'm saying the former Soviet Union? Because to turn the richest country on earth, Swiss titanium, to the so poor and miserable society that only the market power can bring it. Now, by the way, rules of the game relevant to our discussion and other discussions, rate of exchange, rate of interest, marginal rate of income tax, over regulations or regulations, and so on and so forth. Second remark, we are living in an era
cured by information. Panics are about a lack of knowledge, not about knowledge, not about actual information. And therefore, it seems to me that the most effective circuit breaker is enhanced transparency about whatever are the circumstances which have unsettled the markets.
Can I just make a little comment? I'm afraid I don't share your perspective that the coordination among the mechanisms of coordination among the central bankers is adequate. Because if you look, for instance, at the basic thrust of the St. Petersburg communique issued by the G20, it is one of the areas on which the St. Petersburg communique has focused is how to enhance the quality of coordination among the different central bankers in the world. This was also voiced in the G20 communique recently in Australia. So I'm afraid that the area of opaqueness on the extent and quality of coordination among central bankers does remain a matter of some concern.
The issue there is not the extent of coordination, but as you say, the quality of coordination, which is to say, you know, the problem with the European Central Bank is not that it hasn't coordinated well, it's that it's followed bad policies. Coordination does not ensure sound policies. And there is an enormous variation in the quality of policy among central banks, including enormous mistakes by the US Central Bank over an extended period, and large mistakes over a much more extended period by the European Central Bank. That's not a failure of communication and collaboration, it's a failure of understanding and political will.
Thank you. Next question here.
Good morning, sir. I am Abhishek from doing PGDM from IMS Ghaziabad. I just want to raise some issues and express my personal point of view regarding this topic, the volatility. And the current economic scenario is not optimal for equity issuances. And globally, due to volatility, the allocation of investments in emerging markets has been quite standstill. And if you take the example of Indian equity markets in the last year, 2013, that India has seen a total inflow investment of $15 billion, and over the outflow has been only $3 billion, unlike the countries in Southeast Asia, which has seen all their inflows leave. So we should note and accept the fact that if the global investors saw the future story of India as having fundamentally changed, then the outflow in the equity markets has been quite substantial. So the question arises here that is India in a position to handle this volatility? And from a corporate point of view, if one states the fact that yes, the banks, the way they are, the ability of the banks to fund through these situations, the robust institutional framework, and the monetary and the fiscal steps that India were not equipped with in the early 1990s. So I think that yes, there is volatility, and India is in a better position to handle volatility in the current scenario. Thank you.
Question? Please, Alisa.
Hi, my name is Alyssa Ayers. I'm with the Council on Foreign Relations. My question is for Mr. Singh. You spoke about the core problem that the next Indian government will face in trying to deal with fiscal deficit questions and trying to deal with large subsidy programs that have been put into place. But what you noted, and I think nobody has picked up on this, what you noted is that the most difficult set of challenges for the next government will be to try to explain to publics who very much like these kinds of subsidy programs why it would be in their longer term interest to see them scaled back. Periods of high volatility, how do you deal with this political economy question? How do you create an argument about pulling back subsidy programs so to benefit the economy in the longer term, which may not be a winning argument in the short term politically?
Well, I think that, this is a very difficult and complex question because, as I mentioned, that one of the typical features of a bad, large populist expenditure program is orchestrating a rollback of that program without creating a lot of adverse populist sentiment. And therefore, I think that one of the principal challenges would be orchestrating a rollback and moving into better macroeconomic stability by improving the quality of fiscal consolidation, by doing it in a manner which does not expend an excessive amount of political capital of the new government in the initial tenure of its office, and therefore being able to achieve this not in a quick fix, but in a period of time through much better communication. That, for instance, to give an example, I think that it is recognized by the, say, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, which has done a detailed study on the employment security program, that the quality of the asset which has been created through the money which has been spent on the employment security program has been very, very poor, and that there has been a huge wasteful outgo of government expenditure. Now, therefore, restructuring that program, and in a country which is typically lacking in robust social security programs, to have, for instance, an employment guarantee program, which will result in creation of productive assets, is one manner in which you can orchestrate a transition of being able to do so. Or, for instance, in the compulsory food program, which really involves a very large outgo of subsidies, how to really achieve food security without having to transport such large quantity of food to the intended beneficiaries, perhaps by using alternative methods or making a cash transfers, which will achieve the same degree of objective, a better identification, for instance, of the intended beneficiaries, which is an area on which little progress has been made, or to restructure, for instance, the compulsory education program, that while guaranteeing access, how do you improve the quality of the outcome from that guaranteed access by a more robust teacher training program, which will really improve teaching outcome. So I think that I'm looking at government being able to restructure these programs instead of really completely rolling back. And that, I think, involves an administrative, a political, and certainly an information challenge.
I just want to touch on this because I think, especially since the question was asked by an American, I don't think we should ignore the fact that there's another country besides India that has absolutely failed to address the fundamental challenge of how you pull back on these sorts of programs. And I'd just like to go back to a comment that Mr. Fogel made.
Which country do you have in mind?
Well, I mean, the thing about the United States is that despite this challenge, we have other assets and we seem to be able to ignore it, at least temporarily, without any problem. But we have obviously, in an enormous way, failed to address it. You know, it goes back to a point I think that Mr. Fogel made about it's not a matter of left or right, it's a matter of courage and values and so forth. If you look at Ireland, Ireland has addressed these sorts of problems, not perfectly, but they've done it. They managed to find the balance that Mr. Singh was talking about, and they have moved ahead, and their economy is showing the benefits of it. And I think the kind of political will that was demonstrated, so the point is it's possible. Maybe it's possible, but it is a very big challenge. And in the United States, we have not made much progress on that challenge either. So.
Thank you. Question here?
Yeah, I'm coming from Israel, the country of startup, labeled as a startup nation, and one thing we learned to appreciate is contrarian view. And because if it's sort of a solid view, then you take the whole sort of prize or the first prize. So I'd like to present the contrarian view. And so thank God the world is not flat. And thank God there is volatility, because if we didn't have the volatility, and if the world were completely flat, then business strategy would lose its meaning. So I'm echoing what Jonathan has said about the fact that managers actually put volatility lower on their perception. One thing, because maybe we learn to live with that. The other one is that we learn to exploit it. And it's sort of echoing another theme here. So I'd like to say, what are the opportunities that you see in volatility? And I think we are in a country now hosted by a country that actually used the global arbitrage in a very remarkable fashion.
Opportunities in volatility.
Maybe
Do you see any?
Okay, volatility is part of life, of course. It's a matter of extent and so on and so forth. And the question is if there are opportunities in volatility. There are opportunities in volatilities, but most of them are related more to capital market or short-term transactions, is not necessarily bringing a steady state growth, for example. And that is the major question, not if we can ignore volatility, of course not, but reduce, yes. And opportunities are in volatility are mainly very interesting test cases in the university, in the MBA studies. And I know that you are a professor of MBA, of business administration, so that was my final remark.
Any point you want to add?
Volatilities can certainly expose certain weaknesses in certain industries and certain processes which other people can recognize and take advantage of. So it can be very good for a very smart entrepreneur. Overall, volatilities usually have winners and losers. They are distributional phenomena, and in ways which tend to reduce overall growth, at least at that time. So while there may be great winners, and in particular in the period of innovation, certainly in the United States and in other advanced economies, periods which have been characterized by relatively less volatility have also been characterized by stronger growth and stronger and broader income gains than the current period of enhanced volatility, which has been characterized by subpar growth and very little income gains for most people.
May I just make a very quick?
Sure.
I think we've been talking at the economy level, but I think at the company level, which is also part of your question, I think as business leaders in the room, we should be thinking, when we think about volatility, we should be thinking about speed and agility. And those, I think, are very important corporate characteristics to take advantage of the opportunities that are created. There's a CEO in the US that's been quoted as saying, there are no good, slow business decisions. And I don't know whether you want to take it to that extreme or not, but I think that reflects the way of thinking to take advantage of opportunities.
Another remark that crossed my mind, we have not related to, about volatility. I believe that the most risky financial assets of today are the governmental debentures. Now, as you know, pension payments, transfer payments, life insurance payments are directly related to the fair value in the market. Just imagine major changes in interest rates, increased interest rates, what it will affect the pension payments all over.
Next question. So let me maybe raise one last question, because we will have after that to conclude our session. When you look at the present overall picture, the situation that we see is very complex because on the one hand, we see that there is some factors of structural volatility with high and low in terms of what happens on the geopolitical scene or developments on the financial markets. At the same time, what is interesting is what you mentioned, Jonathan, about the fact that, interestingly enough, in your survey, in terms of ranking of concerns, volatility has declined as a source of concern. We might consider that this is a kind of good sign that, in a way, the business leaders have fully integrated that factor as a kind of structural factor. They are learning to live with it. They are learning to manage it. But we could also, in a way, consider that there is the risk that we have come to a little bit dismiss this factor, because we might say, after all, there have been other alarms. We have been able to manage these alarms or this shock. We have been able to come back to life. And so, after all, there will be always a kind of way to get out of it. Would you see in that element the equivalent of what people have called the moral hazard? That, in a way, we will always find out ways to get out of this volatility, to manage it, and then it becomes a reason for underestimating it or becoming too much apathetic to it.
Well, if we're going to go down the row, this is the last question. I think that's maybe the ultimate question about volatility. I guess I'm not sure, to be honest, what the answer is. I do think we have to consider it. I do think in the U.S. case, where the moral hazard question was raised repeatedly over the last 5 years, I don't think we know the answer to the question as to whether or not how it will affect behavior the next time, and there will be a next time at some point. I think I don't know, I suppose, is my complete answer. I think it's a very good question at the highest level.
Maybe
Aharon.
if you try to explain to yourself why you don't know, you're going to find the answer. It's a really tough question. You know, to live in a world, then we are listening to every whisper coming from the Federal Reserve's governor, in the Congress, in a lecture. How we can plan our business if that's the case? And I must say, it's really a stupid approach, but that's the worldwide approach to everything. I can add something more. And I served also for 7 years chairing the advisory committee for our central bank. I don't see any issue with a bank that goes bankruptcy if government or central banks stand and support the bank. Why? And by the way, my suggestion that government, central banks declare that they are going to save any deposit in the domestic currency if a controlled bank is getting in trouble. Why? Because let's assume that in order to save a bank, the central bank has to inject $100 billion to a bank. What happened to the economy then? Really nothing. In the budget or in the flow fund, you write $100 billion. But at the end of the day, you tell the people that have deposits in the bank, the deposit that you have sought, that it's yours, it's really yours. So no effect on the economy. It's not like building a new bridge or introducing a new subsidy. So there are something that should be done in order to reduce volatility with measures that seems cost on, maybe somebody said, oh, it will be, you will cut the education budget and save the bank, but that's not the case. And there are some rigidities in the way of thoughts that we should change in order to improve the situation.
Can I make just one brief observation to your question? Claude, if you did put the moral hazard question in a somewhat more flexible time frame, then for instance, if one were to put that very question of yours somewhat differently, would it be advantageous to pile up the fiscal deficit in a major way to get faster growth today at the expense of much lower growth subsequently? And would there therefore be moral hazard questions in the intergenerational choice on growth trends? Then, of course, one can end up by saying, blessed be thee, because thou shalt inherit my debt. Because I think that there is an embedded moral hazard question in being able to make that kind of intergenerational choice.
It is true that we usually come back from crises. The economies that come back with the most vigor and the most success are those that have the strongest underlying economies. Russia has not come back economically because it has a failed set of economic policies and a failed set of economic institutions. The United States comes back because it has enormous real economic strengths in its human capital, in its physical capital, in the stability of the government, et cetera. Having said that, the costs of those crises are enormous, enormous. That is, the cost for average people, the cost for most companies. So the fact that we come back is not in any way a justification for not taking the steps to avoid these crises. One last comment on moral hazard. We can certainly guarantee that no bank is allowed to fail that can bring down the financial system. But that kind of guarantee comes with regulation. That kind of guarantee is funded by taxpayers, and taxpayers properly demand that if they are going to be on the line for that kind of liability, then there must be regulations to sharply reduce the risk that it occurs. And that means much stricter capital requirements. That means much stricter regulation of the kinds of risks which those institutions take. The worst situation is when you have, and when you have real moral hazard, is when you have a guarantee in the absence of regulation. And as I once told Jamie Dimon, the head of JP Morgan Chase, who complained that JP Morgan had taken money from the US government in the bailout but hadn't asked for it and didn't need it. And I explained, I said, well, Mr. Dimon, there are two issues here. You may not have needed it, but all your counterparties needed it. And if they hadn't been bailed out, you wouldn't be here today. And neither would Goldman Sachs. And the second is, politics is like business. If you put up $1.2 trillion, you get to set the rules. And that's part of this dynamic here of moral hazard. If you are going to be protected from failure, then those who finance that protection get to set the rules.
Thank you. Let me close the session with maybe some points that you have that I have taken from the discussion here. Number one, I think we all agree that we have entered, because of this interconnectivity around the world, the greater connection between market, between economies, we have, in a way, entered an era of structural volatility. This is brought by globalization. There is no way back on that. At the same time, and as a result of that, as Mr. Shapiro, you pointed out, it seems that looking at the last 15 years, we have been into an era of global financial instability. And of course, in that context, the logical question is in these different episodes of global financial instability, what is the next one? What is the country, what is the economy which will be affected by the next one? Then I think feeding this structural volatility in addition to the greater connectivity among economies and financial system is the point that you have raised, which is because we are living in an era of image being sometimes stronger than realities, we get this notion of instant reaction, knee-jerk reaction from markets, from investors. At the same time, I think we need to come back to the point that, and this might be a positive factor, it seems that business leaders, corporations are today better able to integrate this volatility, better able to live with this volatility than was the case a few years ago. And here we come back to the notion of mitigating volatility. In that respect, I think the points that have been raised about better coordination between fiscal and monetary policies, the point about going back to specifics, the point that you have mentioned about better coordination between government and central banks, I think are quite important points, as is also the question of how do you create circuit breakers so that if volatility gets too high, you have a way to get back to it. And this is where, for instance, coordination, better coordination among the G20 countries might be a way to create these circuit breakers which exist when you look at stock exchanges, but do not exist yet at the level of national economies. And then just one last point, which is this notion of enhanced transparency, because if you have enhanced transparency, this might create better predictability, and better predictability might be one of the best way of mitigating and reducing this notion of instability and volatility. This is with that I would like to close this session. And before thanking our speakers, let me tell you that we have now a break, which will be for 15 minutes. And then the next two sessions on infrastructure will be Mumtaz Mahal room. And then the session on education will be in Jehangir. Both rooms are just down the hall, very easy to find. But before we go for a coffee break, again, thanks to our 4 very outstanding speakers.
Slight correction, and to avoid people getting lost, Mumtaz Mahal is on this floor, right down the hall by the escalators. Jehangir is halfway to the lobby, the mezzanine floor. Thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much.